Okay, welcome everybody. Erkan, if you could get people, if you could usher them in just to let them know that we're starting. If you could have a seat, take your coffee or your tea, your little cookie, and just be seated please as we start the next paper. We're going through the conference at quite a pace. It's been quite mesmerizing so far, seeing a variety of remarkably talented speakers at the professional level, having such a moving voice from a living prophet with our bishop. Quite astounding to be able to witness and experience such a story, such a narrative, such a ministry and commitment. It's just a wonderful tribute to the spirit and mission of this university. That's what we're doing, celebrating the integrity of creation. We're now moving to not only a fascinating topic on ecofeminism, but part of our work in the Academy is not just to find the most talented, established scholars whose work is well known and well published and has shaped the debate, but sometimes the most challenging thing of all is to find the newcomer, the new bright spark who is going to be a mover and shaker for decades ahead. That's our next speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Darlene Weaver, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachel Hart Winter. Dr. Winter is the director of the Siena Center at Dominican University, where she's also an instructor in the Department of Theology. Dr. Winter received her PhD from Loyola University, Chicago. Her dissertation, Just Water, a Catholic and Feminist Response to the Commodification of Water, provides a basis for her talk today. Dr. Winter has published work in volumes on just war, on the next generation of pastoral leadership, and she is currently collaborating on an interdisciplinary textbook via the International Jesuit Ecology Project. Dr. Winter blends scholarly expertise in ethics with educational, ecclesial, and intercultural experience. She has worked in the Marshall Islands as part of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and she serves as a board member for the Foundation of Adult Catechetical Teaching Aids. Dr. Winter's work lies at the intersection of higher education, religiously affiliated organizations, and justice advocacy, alerting us to the complex but promising opportunities for problem solving when universities, religious communities, and civic organizations collaborate. Earlier today, the issue of commodifying water has emerged several times. Robert Glennon suggested that commodifying water, essentially asking us to pay more for it, at least asking us in this context to do so, might make us value it more. Others raised concerns that commodifying water could exacerbate existing disparities in wealth, access to resources, living conditions, and health outcomes. Dr. Winter will speak to the issue of water commodification and vulnerable populations in her talk, Our Parched Earth, a Catholic Ecofeminist Response to the Global Water Crisis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Hart Winter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you to all of you that have helped put the conference together, invite those of us that are visiting to be here, and all of you that are here to help us continue the dialogue. I have to say I feel very privileged to speak after the bishop because he, in some ways, contextualized what we're talking about, bringing the issue of water to the people in Brazil, but he also laid some of the groundwork of theology, so he makes my job a little bit easier. But I'm thrilled to join you from the perspective of religion and theology and to think about how we can add value to this debate and discussion about the global water crisis precisely from where we sit in our religious traditions. So I will help us think about how we relate to water, what our stories of water are and what they can be. And I open with just a few thoughts about water, one of my favorite Catholic authors is Flannery O'Connor. Some of you may have read her or studied her. One of her most challenging short stories is called The River. And it's actually the story of a young man who goes to be baptized in a river, and he ends up drowning. So Flannery O'Connor has a very challenging way to get at meaning, but I think she gets at the heart of the issue of water. As we've heard throughout the last 24 hours, it's a life-giving resource, but it's also it can be something that can take away our life if it's not handled properly or if we run into global issues. Another favorite poet of mine, Emily Dickinson, talked about, we know water by thirst. So again, a very fitting description of water. As we've talked about, sometimes we don't pay attention to it, but when it's not there, we're very aware of it. And then finally, one of my favorite movies, A River Runs Through It. I can't help but think about it here in Pittsburgh, the city of three rivers. Norman Maclean, the author of the short story, which was turned into a movie, writes the memoir of his experience of growing up along the river in Montana. And he says at the end of the story, in the end, all things converge into one place, and a river runs through it. I am haunted by waters. So I present you with these three snapshots just to show you how so often water is a part of our context. It is a part of our lived reality, and we're always in relationship with water. So my hope this afternoon is to help us think about our own experiences with water, to understand more deeply how women and water relate, and in the end, come up with some positive solutions, as a lot of our speakers have left us with. So I want to call your attention, before I dive into some of the method and the terms that I'll talk about, to just give you a moment of silence to think about a place that has significance to you that's connected to water. It could be a baptism that you've attended, or perhaps you remember your own baptism. It could be time by an ocean, a river, a lake. Anyone who lives here, I'm sure you have many water memories. The pictures on this slide are from a lake a couple hundred miles from here in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but it's a lake that I've been going to for my entire life. So it's one of the places where I go to reflect, to find meaning. I now have the gift of bringing my children there as they recreate and enjoy the spring-fed lake. But I invite you to think about your own memory of water. And hold it close as I talk. Hopefully, as I share with you some of the realities of the people around the world that I've come to know, we can all go back to our own story of water. We, of course, know that we are watery people. 70% of our bodies are made up of water. We start our lives in the womb surrounded by water. And, of course, we end our lives when there is no water, when we're dehydrated or when we run out of water. Some current stories or images around water. Again, a lot of these were things that have already come up and just things that I pulled from the news this week. There was a new Washington Post study that came out a few days ago about Flint's poisoned water and the effect it had on fetal deaths. So again, it's one of we're still processing, and Nancy did such a good job last night talking about Flint, but we're still processing the ripple effects of that, and I'm sure we will be for years to come. Of course, Puerto Rico, as a few people have mentioned, is on our minds and in our hearts today. I heard last night 3.4 million people there still do not have access to water. So again, as Emily Dickinson prophetically reminded us in a poem, we certainly know water when we thirst. And earlier this year, the Standing Rock water protectors received a lot of news and national attention when they were confronting military who were trying to take them away from their native land as they protected the water. So again, snapshots of water. As I know a pristine water source here in Pennsylvania, many people in our world and certainly in our country do not know the same reality. So briefly, what I'll do this afternoon, and as we've had such engaging dialogue, I really look forward to hearing from all of you. But as a theologian, as an ethicist, I'm always thinking about the world in terms of how we relate to things, how we should relate to things, and perhaps how we might better relate to things. So today I invite us to consider how we relate to water, and perhaps how we ought to relate to water. I'll look briefly at why a theologian and an ethicist has something to say about the global water crisis. And I'll also look at some of the current operative systems for water. We've talked quite a bit about the commodified view of water. I'll look also at water as a sacred good, part of our creation. I'll also look to the tradition of Catholic social thought to talk about how we understand water in our Catholic tradition. And finally, I'll look to ecofeminism, a theory that looks particularly at how women and the earth are harmed by certain practices. And with that, I'll pay close attention to the women that I've studied in research, but also that I've lived with around the world, who bear the burden every day of unclean water. And then finally, I'll end with a way forward, sharing some of the concrete projects I've been a part of and inviting all of us here to consider what we also might do in this response to the global water crisis. So before I dive in, literally, I'm going to share a little bit of a context about how I started this research into water. And I'm also going to share with you a short PBS documentary on the Marshall Islands, which is where the bulk of my contextual experiences and my research began. It just aired this summer, so it's quite recent, and it looks specifically at how the Marshall Islands are dealing with the global water crisis. But before that, I'll share with you, I was a Jesuit volunteer about 20 years ago, and when I was told by the Jesuit director at the time that I was going to the Marshall Islands, I was not certain where they were. So if some of you today don't know, you're right where I was not too long ago. But they're coral atolls in the middle of the Pacific that we'll see on the video. And I remember going through an extensive training before I was sent to be a teacher in the Marshall Islands. The training actually was at the University of Scranton, so again, not too far from here. And people who had served abroad, religious leaders, scientists, they had a plethora of people to help train us to cross cultures. And I remember several of the leaders of the orientation said, whatever you do, whatever country you're in, do not drink the water. We heard that time and time again, and we were all 20, 21, some of us were 22, and we all said, we're going to drink the water. We had no idea of the realities and the context that we were facing. So fast forward a couple weeks, and I'm sitting on the cement floor of a home of a friend that I had gotten to know in the first few weeks. And she was so happy to have me in her home, to share with me some of the local food that she had prepared. And then, of course, she handed me a glass of water. So it was the first time I was confronted with the reality of, I heard the training, the voices in the back of my head saying, do not drink the water. I looked down at the cup of water that I could visibly see things floating in. So I could only imagine what was beyond, as we learned from Nancy, beyond what I could see in the water. And that moment has stayed with me for 20 years. I remember trying to be so gracious and thinking, I want to drink the water. I want to be in solidarity with these wonderful people that are opening their homes to me. But I also knew that if I drank the water, I probably wouldn't be teaching the next day, the next week. So I remember letting the water touch my lips and trying to act like I was receiving the gift of water. But I also knew that I was terrified of what that water reality was for those people. I continued to work with the Jesuit volunteers after I finished the years of service in the islands. I went to places like Tanzania, to Belize, Ecuador, and Kenya, and I time and time again ran into the same experience with water. People would give me water to drink. It would be yellow. It would have things in it. So that's really what propelled both my professional and my personal journey into the questions of water justice, and why some of us are privileged to have a tap that runs 24 hours a day and gives us clean water. But how come the questions of how come so many people in the world do not have that privilege are those that I still wrestle with. So take a moment to watch a few minutes of this video, and again, it'll just help give you a sense of a little bit more about the Marshall Islands.
Two men mix sand and shovelfuls of cement, spending hours on end building their seawall, though rebuilding it, and higher each time. Banga Roriki is working with his nephew Robin, who's been living in this house on Majuro, one of the Marshall Islands, for 22 years.
Tide come very high.
He says the wall is meant to stop massive high tides, known here as king tides, like the one that surged through his home last year. On another of the Marshall Islands, Ebi, those same tides eat away the shoreline everywhere you look. Tombstones shoved free and even swept out to sea. What used to be a park surrounding Ebi's power plant, gone. 74-year-old Belma Marak has already seen king tides destroy several homes here.
I say the corner of the house was right over there, right outside that piece of concrete there.
These big slabs were
Yeah.
part of the foundation of the house?
Yeah.
The Marshall Islands, a nation of slender atolls and 5 more substantial islands, sit in the South Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and Australia, no more than 6 or 7 feet above sea level. Climate scientists warn that if the current pace of global warming and sea level rise continues, then low-lying islands like the Marshalls could become incapable of sustaining their population within a generation or 2.
Sea level is rising in certain parts of the Pacific faster than anywhere else in the world.
Chip Fletcher studies climate science at the University of Hawaii. He says that well before the Marshall Islands might disappear, they could face a more immediate impact from climate change, freshwater shortages. What's the biggest threat now to the Marshall Islands?
Depends on your time scale. I think the longer time scale, sea level rise is probably the biggest threat, simply because it has the potential to rise above the average elevation of the Marshall Islands. Shorter time scale, though, it's the fundamental need for fresh water.
On Ebi, fresh water is Belma Marak's biggest worry. In his home, the spigots hooked up to the town water system are dry.
No water.
His son lugs buckets of water so the family can shower and flush their toilets. The family relies on rainwater catchment tanks for water, but those remain practically empty because of a relentless drought.
We barely have any water. Probably this much. Barely have enough.
Getting fresh water has always been a preoccupation for the Marshall Islands. Most communities rely on rainwater collection, rooftop gutters connected to water tanks outside of virtually every home, and a few underground freshwater aquifers they can access through wells. The fresh water is essential for cleaning, personal hygiene, doing laundry, and of course for drinking. But as life in the islands became more westernized and the population grew to more than 50,000 people, those limited freshwater sources became more stressed than ever. And now, because of climate change, the traditional water sources are at increased risk. The droughts are getting so long that collecting enough rainwater is becoming harder and harder. The freshwater wells and underground aquifers are at risk of being fouled by saltwater from frequent flooding. Some wells already spoiled because of high tides driven by rising sea level. Those so-called king tides now sweep over the Marshalls more intensely and more frequently. It's an irony not lost on some climate change experts that while the Marshall Islands are among the sovereign nations that contribute the least to global warming, they're also among the nations that face threats that are the most profound and immediate. Hilda Heine, the president of the Republic of Marshall Islands, is keenly aware of the paradox of living here. It's the old cliche, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink.
Been fighting this climate change for the last maybe 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Our islands are still livable. So we continue to have hopes. And so I think we're able to make sure that people are safe. And during droughts, we're able to provide water, food, and so on. So that's what we need to do. It's the new norm, but that doesn't mean giving up.
President Heine says the government has made freshwater access a priority and points to improvements in the centralized water systems.
So that gives you a little bit of a picture of some of the things that I'll talk more about. And I just think it's so important. One thing that a lot of my colleagues that I'm still in touch with in the Marshall Islands, they have made climate change and access to water the most pressing priority that they're facing, whether they're artists, whether they're scientists, librarians, teachers. Water has really taken on, it's become a unifying force. And you can see why on islands that live so close to water in terms of rising sea level, and also for people that struggle to find clean water. So again, just a few more facts about the Marshall Islands, because as we heard from the bishop, and as I'll look at when I get to ecofeminism, that sense of context becomes so important to try to understand the people that we're drawing stories from. So the islands are 24 coral atolls. which, as you saw in the video, the highest point in Majuro, which is the capital and the most populated island, is 6 feet above sea level, and it's a human-made bridge. So that's not even the natural height. So it just gives you a sense of how very vulnerable they are. The king tides that the PBS special looked at are becoming more and more prevalent. When I was there 17 years ago, we might get a king tide every couple months. And I remember we never kept anything on the floor because it was common that the house would have a few inches of water in it. So to think that that reality is more common now is something that's hard for me to imagine. Imagine living in a home where you couldn't put things on the floor because the risk of water was real. The Marshall Islands also have a complicated history before climate change. They're the site that we tested the atomic bomb. About 30 different tests after Hiroshima. The U.S. needed a site that was remote where we could test the effects of the nuclear radiation. So Henry Kissinger found these remote islands that were not very populated. You can see in this slide they have lagoons which serve as a contained area within the water. So we detonated time and time again tests there. The U.S. primarily used 4 of the atolls and tried to evacuate, but records and people that I met when I was there show the evacuation was not done well. And people are still tracing cancer back to some of the radioactivity that is still found in the islands. So again, it just shows some of the layers that we can get into when we start to wade into these issues. There are people that have a truly communal way of life. Like many of us who have lived or spent time in other countries, I always feel that we learn so much from these cultures, and that's a lot of what I bring to my research on water. They still keep their traditional culture very much intact, even though, as the video showed, the Western influence continues to increase. Some of the livelihood there, of course, is fishing, as we saw in Brazil. The women create handicrafts and sell them, but a very strong sense of culture and the oral storytelling that lives to pass those cultures on. But again, as the video revealed, and as we'll look at when we look more closely at Pope Francis's message, they are one of the nations that contribute minimal effects to global warming and climate change, but they are certainly the most vulnerable. They're sort of on the frontiers. So briefly, I want to share a little bit about the role of theology and ethics. And as I started, inviting you to think about your own story around water and sharing some of my own favorite stories with water. I think when I started studying water about 15 years ago from those experiences in the islands, and then when I came to Loyola and sort of found that that was the field that I wanted to write in, there were a few theologians who weren't sure what to do with someone who wanted to look at science. But I think we're seeing, and certainly this conference is one of the effects of it, that issues like climate change and global warming truly do need an interdisciplinary approach. We've heard from scientists that are leading the way, policymakers, people that are on the ground, and a lot of them have already mentioned how we value water, how we relate to water is one way to help us bring about change. So you can imagine, I shared with someone last night my surprise when Pope Francis 2 years ago wrote an encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si. So I was thrilled to see that more theologians, more people in the church communities are taking these issues seriously. Pope Francis, for those of you who have looked at the encyclical, has about 4 paragraphs on water, and then he talks about it throughout the letter. And I shared with someone last night, when it was published, my brother called me and said, "Do you think he cited your dissertation?" So in 4 paragraphs, he managed to say what I took about 300 pages to say. So if you want a crystal version of it, look to Pope Francis. But again, his training as an undergrad was as a chemist, and you really can see, as I'll talk about when I look at our tradition in the Catholic Church, a shift to pay more attention to the earth and the environment, and to bring some real scientific weight there. So another reason that I think it's important for religious communities, churches, theologians, academics who take up these things is that we can really help people read the signs of the times. The bishop before me talked about Vatican II, and that was one of the main takeaways from it, that we had to situate our theology in the realities of the world. So certainly the water crisis is one of those realities that needs attention. And as I said, this is a unique moment to see students, to see professionals. I met someone who's in a Christian life community. So to think about all of these people coming together for a common cause, that's really the way forward. Holmes Rolston is one of the academics who I think gives us a great quote to sort of summarize why it's important to bring the religious voice. He quotes, "Enough, share. In this environment of overpopulation, overconsumption, and maldistribution, if one asks what are the human institutions most likely to curb these maladaptive appetites with a sense of a more inclusive and longer range common good in a finite world, there is a clear answer: the world religions." So again, it's great to be here with all of you and to add sort of the ideas that can come from ethical communities. And I certainly speak from the Catholic tradition, but I know some of our questions earlier today, we talked about the Muslim tradition around water. I've lectured quite a bit on the interfaith realities of water. So again, I speak from my tradition, but I think we can all share stories of water across various traditions and cultures and how it really can be a unifying and life-giving source throughout many different ways to find meaning. So again, I'll look at some of the value systems that I'll talk about that help us understand water and how we relate to it. So certainly the idea of a commodity has come up quite a bit. And I think it's important to say, and as I opened with our stories around water, that water is one of those things that I think we can all say is sacred. Whether we ascribe to a tradition or to a spirituality, when you stand in Pittsburgh and are close to the rivers, you might be at an aquarium and you're standing in front of water. People often share that when they're in front of water, their heart rates can slow. You might feel a certain peace or connectedness with nature. So those are some of the arguments that I talk about in terms of looking at water as a commodity, something that you can buy, that you can bottle and sell, versus honoring water as a sacred gift, seeing water in its full context. The Catholic Church, as we'll see throughout my presentation, is pretty outspoken that it is a universal human right, that it is something that should be accessible to all people. As Robert shared this morning, the legal legs of a statement like that can be tricky, but again, I think if all of us in religious organizations are arguing for water as a human right, it's at least a place to start. So the church views it as something that is universal and an inalienable right, so something that is there for everyone. So again, we've heard it a few times. It actually was in the video. It was Samuel Coleridge who said, "Water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink." So he said this, I think I have the date wrong, it was quite some time ago, but again, thinking of a prophetic statement that now we really are in a time and a place where there is water. We see water on the globe, but a lot of it is certainly not drinkable. So when I talk about water as a commodity, there are a few things that I use to describe it in that way. And again, Robert this morning shared that we probably should be paying more for water. And I agree. I think certainly in our context that sometimes when we're not paying enough for water, we don't value it properly. But when I talk about it as a commodity, I think I want to connect it to how we value water. So in terms of a commodity, I think of it as something that can be bought, traded, or sold. So something that we go to the store to buy. Also something that we let the market set the price for. And this is where a lot of the concern over the justice issues can emerge. It's also something when we think about commodities that we might think of as unlimited, something that we can continue to use without worrying because we can always go to the store to buy more. And then finally, stemming from those views, sometimes we waste it, we overuse it, we pay little regard to water because in our context, it's always there. I think about cell phones in our current context. I think now it's every year or two people get a new cell phone. So we've created a sense with commodities that we don't even need to care for them in some ways. We can always just go to the store and replace them. Another approach to water is, do we take it for granted? Are we unaware of it? As Nancy shared last night, when civil and civic engineers do their job so well, water is in our tap all the time, and we really don't have to pay attention to to it. So we can tend to be unaware of it. So again, failure to use common sense. I know my neighbors in Chicago sometimes will leave their sprinkler on for 8 hours a day. I'm hoping that they've forgotten, but again, that's something that we are allowed to do in our context. Again, a lack of education around sustainable uses of water. When we're not taking it for granted, or when we are taking it for granted, we can tend to dismiss it and think we don't need to do certain things. And again, as the Emily Dickinson poem reminds us, we really might only think about it when we don't have it. And then the final, a move to see it as something that is a sacred part of our commons. And this is where Pope Francis comes in, and several people in the tradition are trying to remind us that creation is an integrated system and that water is one of those goods of the commons, something that is sacred, something that can connect us to creation in a unique way. So again, if you think of the water memory that you might have called in the beginning, how is water a conduit to connect you to your environment? Something to remind us of who we are as people and how we relate to the world. So again, we certainly get our understanding of water from how we price it. I know particularly in Chicago, there's a lot of work now that they are trying to increase the price for water. And as Robert said this morning, I think that's something that we should all think about in terms of how the market prices it. But I also think it's important beyond understanding it in the market and the pricing values to look to other cultures and respect and learn from them on how they relate to water. Some of the stories I'll share when I get to women in water are from my time in the Marshall Islands, that it is those people that live in a vulnerable relationship with resources that sometimes have the most creative and sustaining uses for them. I don't know, some of you may have seen, if you have young kids or are interested in it, but the Disney movie Moana, has anyone seen that? So I've seen it a few times, but I really enjoy there's the video that I have from Netflix or Amazon. After it has about 2.5 hours of interviews with the producers, and it's a beautiful experience that they went through in going to the islands and learning an island culture. And those of you that are familiar with the movie, water is a character in the film. So it really shows how a lot of island people, as you can see from the video and what an atoll looks like, water is a part of their everyday life. They, in the Marshall Islands, people sleep with their head facing the ocean, not the lagoon. There are sort of sacred rituals that people have around their relationships with water. So again, I think we can look to other cultures to understand how they value and care for water. One moment that I remember so well, you saw in the video the catchments that people use in the islands. I was staying with a family during the summer that I was there, and we were in one of the smaller islands that had no roads, no cars. It was serviced by an airplane once a week. And the host family that I was staying with, their catchment was getting very low. And I remember sharing with one of the sisters in the family that I was very worried about what would happen when the catchment ran out of water. And I remember she said to me, "Don't worry, God will provide." And in our context, we, as I said, we always have water. But it really showed me that in certain cultures, they live in a way of trust, in sort of an integral balance with nature. I was lucky for that month that I was there that there was always enough water. But as I said, it propelled my work to try to understand the realities of people that don't live in that context. So when I argue against viewing water as a commodity, as I've showed, there certainly can be values to pricing it. But I think the commodious view of water limits it. It gives us a very narrow way to understand water and to view it. And critics of seeing water as a commodity argue that when we take it out of its natural environment, when we only relate with water in the store through a bottle, that we're disconnected from the true value of water and from the reality. Vandana Shiva, who is an ecofeminist, talks about when we can value water for its social and ecological value, then we have a greater chance of using it in a way that's equitable and sustainable. So again, that sense of broadening our focus or constantly understanding how we relate to water and what our value systems are. Another idea, when we think of water as a commodity, someone owns that water. The market sets a price to it. So it gives us a sense, again, that we are in control of the resources of the earth. And I think we can certainly see, especially in the last few weeks, with issues that are increasing storms, we're seeing more water issues. We certainly do not control the earth, and many can argue that our human impact is what's churning up so many things. So, but again, as Robert said, I would not argue that we move towards a sense of free water, but I just think we have to be so careful when we talk about it as a commodity to make sure we're understanding it within its fuller context and the fuller picture. So again, just a note about how a worldview can be so significant in terms of how we relate to water. Bretton Woods was a conference that happened in the U.S. It brought people from 43 countries together. It's what formed what became the IMF and the World Bank. It was 1944, so World War II was coming to an end, and the world economic system was in a state of disarray. So these were leaders that were coming together to try to jumpstart the economy and to think about hopeful ways to bring people out of the war moment that they were in. And the remarks of the conference, so again, these are economists, legal leaders in their communities trying to get to have people invest in the economy. They talked about the fruits of material progress on an earth infinitely blessed with natural resources, and mentioned things that prosperity has no fixed limits. So again, this set a course, and we certainly still see this today, and some of the presenters have already shared, a sense of overconsumption that we've heard a few times, business as usual. If we continue in this way of thinking about unlimited resources, we certainly know that we're sort of headed towards disaster. In a completely different view and idea towards water, Pope Francis in Laudato Si mentions that we can't sustain this level of consumption. We've exceeded acceptable limits, and we still are dealing with issues of those on the margins. So again, it's a reminder of how ethics and religion certainly can help move forward in terms of a response, working with scientists and working with the law to figure out ways to understand these concepts in terms of worldviews. So I just think it's such a stark contrast to think about how people that come together to shape these ideas can really give a lot of value to the discussion. So looking now at the Catholic tradition to mine some of the resources that are there, and then to also look to some of the biblical stories, again, as places to look to find different values for water. The picture on the screen is the baptism of my third child about a year and a half ago. And I always think, for those of us that are Catholic, the sacraments are such a beautiful way to think about the resources of our earth and to also try to think about more sustainable uses around them. As I shared with you my experiences in the Marshall Islands, I never saw clean water, and I went to several baptisms. So thinking about if we were in our American context and you went to the baptismal font and it was filled with sand and mud and insects floating, it's something that we have a hard time imagining. The baptismal rite actually calls for pure and clean water. So it's just interesting to think about these rituals, but I think they take on a strong meaning when we couple them with the water crisis. In my dissertation, I wrote quite a bit about a way to reimagine the sacrament of baptism. And now I'm sort of laughing because at my church, I'm one of the leaders of the baptismal prep. So little do they know that they're going to get a little bit of water theology. But again, I think it's trying to find places where we can talk about the global water crisis for people that are investing in our traditions and our rituals. Another place that I think is always helpful too to look is the biblical appreciation for water. Water is mentioned in Scripture 600 times, so it's one of the most common things that we read about in Scripture. And I think the authors of the biblical stories, they seem to have a unique relationship with water. They appreciate it as a creative force, yet they also know the destructive power of water. We know many stories from our tradition that are around water as a place of death and destruction. Water for the biblical authors is sustaining. It's something that people know that you need to be in right relationship with in terms of a livelihood and flourishing. And it also throughout the scriptures is a conduit for God's blessing and God's presence. So again, some of you may have imagined your experience with water. Often it is something that connects us to the sacred. So just like we might look to another culture, the Marshall Islands, we might see it in literature or in movies, our own sacred stories can also be a place to look. So, and I always say when I'm speaking about this, I certainly wouldn't look to the biblical place to find rules for how to deal with our ecological crisis today, but I do think it presents a certain humility in front of water, to recognize the power of water, and to try to be in right relationship with our creation. One of the textbooks that's now published called Healing Earth, I'll show a slide for it at the end, but it's an interdisciplinary textbook where I worked with ethicists, spiritual leaders, scientists, all based at Loyola University Chicago. And it took a few years, and it's finally launched, and the creators of the book just received a special recognition from the Pope for its work as an innovative response to the global crisis. But I'll never forget, one of the scientists said to me at the first meetings, he said, "I can't work with you. You use the Bible as a place to go for science." And I thought, I sort of laughed and, realized really there are so many stereotypes and ideas from our individual fields. A couple years later, he learned that I have an undergraduate in neuroscience, and I come at these issues from a rigorous science. And I just remember him saying, I never would have known, that a theologian could think about ecology in this way. So I think it's so important for all of us from our different fields to dialogue and to try to work together to find these creative solutions. So again, the Catholic social tradition, the idea of the common good is one of the places that I look to find an argument to support the protection of water and a particular value of water. But throughout history, the tradition was often very focused on the human being. Of course, that has all changed with what Pope Francis has done. And I've always found myself in conversation with other scholars who are trying to extend the tradition to move beyond an anthropocentric or a view that just focuses on the human, and to try to see the human embedded in an ecosystem. And just like the story I shared, I think Pope Francis has reminded us how important it is to have a continual conversation between religion and science, because they're two fields that are very distinct, but when they come together, you can find some great points of contact, but also some places for creative and innovative responses to solutions. So again, I'll focus for a minute or two now on Laudato Si before I turn to women. But it's great here to meet Daniel, is it Schneid? And Bill French was one of my dissertation directors at Loyola. But those are two people that I've been impressed with by their work and have used it in my own scholarship, that are saying that within our tradition, we have these resources. Thomas Aquinas is one of the doctors of the Catholic Church and one of the greatest theologians that we still turn to. And he, in the year 1200, was writing about a cosmic or a common good, which Dan argues we can think about in a cosmic way. But he had a sense of right relationship with nature. There's a lot we can critique about Aquinas, but I think it's important to know that some of these ideas have been a part of our tradition. Now that I'm at Dominican, one of the series I run is named Albertus Magnus. So it's named after Albert the Great, who educated Aquinas. Both of them are Dominicans. But Albert the Great was a botanist and a theologian. So it's also, I think, a reminder that the Catholic tradition is rich with leaders and scholars that have continually tried to put these ideas in conversation. So Laudato Si really was a game changer for all of us in ecology and religion. As I said, for a long time, the church had mentioned global issues and had talked about the right to water, but it had not really done it in such an integrated way. Some of the quotes that Pope Francis mentions show sort of a real concern for science, but also for the human person and our moral dimensions. He talks about the indispensable issues of we need life to support not only the human experience, but also our ecosystems, our aquatic sources. He talks quite a bit about water poverty. He is from Argentina. He's the first pope who is not from a European context. So he brings a great contextual methodology. A lot of what Bishop Neto shared, I really think Pope Francis brings a refreshing sense of being rooted in a different context than what we're familiar with. So he talks and writes quite a bit about water-borne diseases. He also talks about the dangers that can occur from commodification of water. And one of the things he really leaves us with is the hope that we start new dialogues. So again, a lot of what is happening here at this conference. He talks about environmental destruction as something that affects us all. So it's taking on a new dimension of something that affects the people that come after us, which is, again, a huge move for the church to be thinking in these ways. And I think one of the greatest things that I always write about or think about now, he talks a lot about especially the issues with water, that sometimes it's educational, or that it's we don't actually think about water in terms of our actions or our behaviors. So I think that's another great place where the church can make a stand, raising awareness, trying to think about education. As I said, the sacrament of baptism is one of those places that you can think about raising awareness around water justice. So again, a lot of the ideas that he mentioned, some of them are complex scientific solutions, some of them are compelling moral arguments for action, but some of them, again, are just very simple steps. Things like turning off the water when we're brushing our teeth, finding ways to reuse water. So I think he's, in a lot of ways, inviting all of us into the response to the global water crisis. I pulled out just a few pieces on global inequity because, again, I think it shows his real ability to think about the true context of people. And this slide is from a friend of mine fishing in the Marshall Islands. But I think he talks in this quote about the depletion of fishing reserves, small fishing communities, and some of the issues that can happen on coastal populations. So in some ways, as I read that a few years ago, I thought perhaps he's been to the Marshall Islands. He seems to really get to the heart of what the most vulnerable among us are facing. And I remember a friend sharing with me when I was in the Marshall Islands, we were out in the lagoon on a small boat going to another part of the island, and there was a huge fishing boat in the lagoon, and there was a string between two poles on it that was filled with shark fins. There were probably 50 shark fins. And so I asked my Marshallese friend, what are they doing with those shark fins? And she shared the story of how the Marshallese had sold the right to fish for sharks in the lagoon to the Japanese. There was some small monetary exchange, which at the time the Marshallese people were in desperate need of money. So the lease, I think, was 100 years. So for 100 years, the Marshallese people are not able to fish the shark in their lagoons. And what made it even more challenging to hear was, as I shared, it was just shark fins. So the Japanese only had a need for the fin. So they would catch the fish, cut the fin, and let the rest go. Instead of the traditional Marshallese fishing practices, which of course would use every part of the fish down to the fat that lined the intestines. So just a terrible sort of multi-layered injustice that they were so in need of a solution that they don't own the rights to the fish in their own lagoon, but then another country is coming in and doing unsustainable fishing. So it's what I so appreciate with Pope Francis, that I think he gets to the reality of a lot of these issues that are more complex than the simple solutions that we might want to think about. So again, I'll turn now to share a little bit about the specific context of women and water, and then share some of the responses from the ecofeminist tradition. So a lot of the research that I did over the last couple of years, most of it is from the UN. So there's a lot of data, and new data is always emerging about how women bear the greatest burden of compromised water sources. Women, of course, have a very intimate relationship with water. In most of the villages that I traveled to, the women knew the water systems. They knew how to get the water. They knew how to manage the water. And the men sort of took on a backseat role. But the irony is that, of course, it was the men in most of these cultures that were making decisions around water, ignoring the voice of the women. For instance, in the Marshall Islands, Thursday was often a day that we didn't have running water. As people have mentioned before, it was connected to the electricity, and the power was often off, sometimes for the whole day, sometimes for a couple hours. So not only was it an issue on Thursday, but women would spend the day prior, on Wednesday, preparing for that time without water. So just a reality that's hard for us to imagine in terms of the availability of water that we know. I spent time in Tanzania, where I was always struck by the strong Maasai women who were walking along the road, just like the pictures you see here, carrying 20 kilos or more of water on their head. And they weren't carrying it from here to the back of the room. They often were carrying it several miles, and they would do it every day. So again, I was always struck. I never saw a man doing that in any of the cultures that I've traveled to. The work of water was always women's work. The estimation by the UN of the time that women spend hauling water is 40 billion hours per year. So think about that in terms of a concept of if we work a 40-hour work week. I mean, just when you accumulate how many things women are not doing because they're using their time to move water over long distances. One of the complicating factors around looking at women and water is the UN is starting to focus more on it, but for a long time, no one was studying these ideas side by side. So there's a great sense that we don't know the full story. Studies show that women are more prone to blindness, and just recently it's been linked to some of the bacteria that women often get from infected water, and then they pass it on to their children. So women and children have higher rates of blindness in a lot of African countries. So it's now that we're starting to put these things together that I think there are more voices that are speaking out and sharing the grave reality. Malaria is more common for women. Again, malaria often is found around water. The health a woman experiences, imagine carrying that amount on your head every day. A lot of women have extreme scoliosis, their spines are disformed, and also the reality of the miles that they walk to get that water. They'll often have to go through dangerous villages. They usually cannot go alone, but there's a host of things that go into the reality of women and water. So as I said, people are starting to pay a little bit more attention, but it's a reality that has plagued women for the last century. This is a slide that just shows a little bit about the different stages of a woman's life. In pregnancy, there are numerous complicating factors, dehydration, malaria, as I shared, all sorts of things that when a woman is pregnant, usually, especially in our context, we pay special attention to. When there's not water, it's a much more challenging process. Similarly, at birth, if you can imagine giving birth in a place where there's not clean water or adequate sanitation. I often share the stories that in the Marshall Islands, people really avoided the hospitals because there was increased risk of infection. There was not food or water at the hospitals. There was no trash pickup. You know, the layers go on. But so giving birth in conditions like that can be, of course, challenging. If we think about the childhood experience, it's usually women that don't go to school, lose out on an education because of the water reality that I mentioned before. And the impacts keep piling on. So when you get to a woman who is in adulthood, in a place that's water stressed, you have such a different reality in relationship with water. So ecofeminism is the theory that I landed on to really help unpack some of these issues. And it's really an extension of feminism that the scholars who I work with recognize that there was a dual implication, that as women are harmed, the earth is harmed. Or when we're harming the earth, we're often putting a greater burden on women. So it was people that looked at these intersecting realities to say that there is the problem is related, and therefore the solutions have to stem from something that can help both women and the earth. It's a great type of scholarship because it really offers a robust critique of some of the practices that we've talked about. When you let the economic market price water, it's the earth that suffers. No one's pricing the water that needs to return to the river, or no one's thinking about the women that aren't going to school because of the water. Ecofeminism also is a theory that honors the sacredness of all creation and all creatures, so certainly prioritizes the experience of women. And it offers a contextual methodology. So again, as I shared at the opening, my experiences in the Marshall Islands were what led me to know that there had to be some creative solutions. Like Pope Francis in his recent encyclical, ecofeminism is concerned with looking at the whole cosmos, so not just one particular area, but thinking about things, stepping back and having a broader focus. And it also celebrates the interdependence of communities. So again, some of the most inspiring stories around women in water were the creative ways that women were working together. So ecofeminism, it truly honors this and raises it up as we are relational people and that everything we do is interdependent. Kuntala Lahari Dutt is an Indian ecofeminist, and I love, she talks a lot about water and women being fluid realities, that the gender stereotypes for women are always in flux in the same way that water is always in flux. She says that water is a metaphor for social, economic, and political relationships, a barometer of the extent to which identity, power, and resources are shared. And she's one of the many people that are calling for a gendered approach to water, saying that we won't find solutions until we can understand the complex issues that are increasing the water crisis, especially as it pertains to women. So briefly, just a few of the scholars that I use for those of you that might want to look further into this, and just a few notes about why I've landed on them. Ivone Gabarra is a Brazilian Catholic sister. So again, someone who would take up a lot of the things that Bishop Neto talked about. She constantly keeps her dialogue, her theology in dialogue with the people she's working with in Brazil. And she works with, again, some of the most marginalized. She shares the realities. She says, they wash clothes. When there is water, there is no soap. When there is soap, no water. So again, just some of those realities that she's in touch with. So of course, her theology takes on an urgency. A lot like the liberation theology we looked at before. These are people that are saying, something is not right and we need a more robust response. Sally McFaig is a prophetic voice from the Protestant tradition. Some of her recent books, she writes a book called A New Climate for Theology, and the cover is all water. So she's someone who has taken her main focus has been to think about the earth as God's body. So if we're harming the earth, if we are abusing resources, in a way we're disrespecting God and our relationship with creation. So hers is an embodied theology. So again, it takes awareness of how we are embodied people and how we live in an earth that also has aspects of being an embodied place. And finally, Rosemary Radford Ruther is one of the leading feminist scholars in the Catholic tradition and also turns a lot of her attention to the ecological crises. And she looks particularly at male domination. She critiques it in terms of how it operates in the church, but certainly how it operates in our global economic system. So again, these are three of the women that are leading the way of saying we have to unpack these problems and we have to pay special attention to women and the realities that they face. As I said, though, it's also some of the women that I look to find great hope, and they have some imaginative solutions. One story to mention before I look to some of the conclusions. I remember when I was in the Marshall Islands, again, this was with the host family in the summer when our catchment was almost out of water. We were sitting one day in the home, had one room with a few small spaces off of it for people to sleep. And we must have spent most of the day sitting in there. It was hot. It was the dry season, so it was hard to be outside in the middle of the day. And I remember one of the sisters at the end of the day said, to me that I got up a lot to go to the bathroom. And I was surprised. I thought, well, how did you notice that? And she went on to tell me that it's jaje manet, which is Marshallese for bad custom, for a woman to walk across a room when men are present. So again, it was just one of those layered realities for me that the women there lived in a context where they could not cross the room of their house if a man was there. So of course they had all sorts of stomach issues, the reality of holding their urine for hours instead of getting up to go to the bathroom. So it was just, again, a moment for me to realize the privilege I have from being in a context where no one's looking at when and how we use, sanitation practices. But for a lot of women, the reality is complexified by gender norms, cultural ideas. So again, it's that sense of women are in this unique relationship with water, and it's some of the response, I think, that we need to unpack. So again, from the sense of ecofeminism, it's looking for creative solutions and hope-filled solutions. Yvonne Gabarra writes in a book, Longing for Running Water, "To seek living waters is to prefigure our hope. And the living water is life itself, since its very beginning, since its primordial reality, since its origins still present in ourselves." So again, it gets to that sense of water is everything. It's part of who we are, it's our biology, but it's also our reality in the world that we live in. And finally, Sally McFagg offers the idea that the small things we do are not going to change the world, but they'll have an impact. People will start to notice. I was telling someone earlier today, in terms of Catholic institutions, the Catholic Church owns 70,000 buildings just in the U.S. So think about that reality. If every Catholic institution said they were going to have a neutral carbon footprint, like we learned this conference has, or if every one of those buildings was going to do something to recycle their water. So again, those are some of the mobilizing forces that I think when we join our discussion to religious communities, there's a mass of people often that are ready to be mobilized towards some of these issues. So I think that that also helps us look to a way forward, the things that we can do that might help us find solutions. So quickly, I just want to show you the textbook that I mentioned. This was launched probably about a year ago, and it's online. It's a free textbook there were about 30 of us that worked on it, so you can imagine the meetings and the complexity. But I think the end product is truly something that is interdisciplinary in every scope. The main idea of the book is to take a scientific textbook that deals with climate change, water, biodiversity, but then to connect that science with ethics and spirituality. So the chapter that I worked on, water, I'll just click on it just so you can see quickly. You can look at, and we keep it updated. The idea of the online textbook is that we're constantly adding new material. But if you look on the right, it shows with each chapter, there's an introduction, there's an overview. But then if you look further down, we look at the science of water, we look at the ethics, the spirituality. We invite people to consider places they can go for action. And the use of the textbook is predominantly for beginning college-age students and also advanced high school students. But I found that I can use it in parish communities. So it's a resource I share with you just to show some of the creative solutions when different people come together. Let me see if I can go back. And then a few other just brief things to share about different places. Sorry. Okay. When I was at Loyola University Chicago, I was part of a group of, again, scientists and theologians that would teach, they were called STEP water classes, and it stood for the way that we would take these topics. Sometimes it was food, sometimes water, There was a class on biodiesel, and we would approach it from various disciplines. So the group that, the students that were in the water class, one of their projects was to get rid of water bottles on Loyola's campus. And it took years, but they were successful in getting rid of water bottles. And again, the idea of bottled water has come up a few times today. I know whenever I teach a class, I talk about it at the outset, that the reality for me with bottled water is having lived in an ocean where you see the waste wash up on the shores of the coast. I come at it more from not only are we able to drink the water out of our taps, but the waste of the plastic that gets thrown. So I was so proud to work with those students and to know the students that they had to go up against the Coca-Cola contract. They had to work with the president of the university, the board of trustees. They really, shook some things up. But it's great to know whenever I go back to Loyola, they still have no water bottles. And you can see it now, it's part of the mindset. The students are proud of it, and they're happy to go the extra step to bring a water bottle to campus. When it first happened a couple years ago, you would notice in the beginning of the semester, students would have water bottles in classes, and then by the end, kind of the norm shifted and no one would bring them. So again, I think it's little movements like that, especially at university communities where students are often leading the way. I'm at Dominican University now, and as I've talked and written about water there, I've since learned that they have a recycled sort of catchment that was buried under their water, similar to some of the reuse products we've had. But instead of just getting rid of it and sending it to the landfill, they were able to refurbish it and use it to catch irrigated runoff rainwater from the soccer field. And now they reuse that water to water the grass. So not only is it an ecological, a great thing to share, but the cost savings is substantial because they're saving, I think, 60,000 gallons of water use a year. One thing to mention too, that some of you may be familiar with the Catholic Climate Covenant. It's another great resource of places to go for action, advocacy, different things we can do. Dan Measley is the director, and he's someone who's come to our university a few times to share what they're doing and to help, especially all of those of us in Catholic communities. Another good friend, and I'm sure all of us could share kind of our contacts, but Sylvia Hood Washington is a woman I've worked with who is offering green healing clinics, recognizing that global climate change often affects the poor and the marginalized. So she works with people that have higher rates of asthma based on where they live, have a harder time getting clean water. So again, I think it's for all of us to imagine, who we know and what things we can do to help move this forward. Dig Deep is another organization by an alum of Loyola that looks at bringing water, especially to Navajo reservations here in the U.S. And I was happy to hear about, again, the carbon neutrality of this conference. And when we open it up to questions, I'd love to hear more about what you all are doing here. And finally, I want to end with a poem. This is the end of a poem written by a friend who's a Marshallese poet. And as I said at the beginning, the Marshallese are finding creative ways to raise awareness about climate justice. And this young woman, Kathy, a few months ago spoke in front of the UN delegation when they were meeting on water. So she has, come from her small island and really made an impact in the world. But her poem really gets to the reality we saw on the video, and I'll close with it here. Tell them about the water, how we have seen it rising, flooding across our cemeteries, gushing over the seawalls, and crashing against our home. Tell them what it's like to see the entire ocean level with the land. Tell them we are afraid. Tell them we don't know of the politics or the science, but tell them that we see what is in our own backyard. Thank you. So we have some time for questions, if anyone, or comments, or again, sharing of ideas of what people are doing here, or in whatever place you find yourself. I think the mic is coming.
Hello, thank you. I wondered if you could say something about how we can better appreciate the traditional cultures and knowledge that women might have that would offer us some unusual solutions that we might not have seen that are sitting right in front of us. Let me give you a quick example. This is a basket that is sold now by the hundreds or even thousands if you purchase them. And these are made by women as a form of a small business, and the women are the only ones maintaining these large expanses of wetland plants that would have otherwise gone down into ditches, and turned into agricultural fields. But these women are maintaining these wetland plants because they then use these as a commercial product. It used to seem that weaving baskets was sort of like a woman's job that they would want to abandon because it was old-fashioned. But now their knowledge of how to build these wonderful structures and maintain the wetlands is now helping their business and their environment. How can we find more of examples like that?
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing. I mean, I think precisely what you're doing here and finding moments like this where perhaps one of the women who makes them could come or sell them. But I really do think it's finding more ways to share the stories, but also to honor that sacred work that women are doing. I know one of the I think most powerful things I did in the Marshall Islands was, like many of us, listen to the people and learn from them. And they often would say to me, "Oh, no, your culture does it better." And I would say, no, I want to learn from your culture. So I think it's ways to honor those stories and to find places to share them. So I would say, if there's a community that you're connected with that you could sell those, or if there's any way to bring one of those women, or now I'm finding in our interconnected world, Skype can be a great resource. So to find ways to share that story. I know at Dominican, our business students go to Africa, they go to Kenya, and they're always bringing back beautiful scarves and things that local women have made. So I think it's finding the right ways to make those connections and share that. So thank you, because I think there's an environmental impact too for the work, the sacred knowledge. So thanks.
Yeah, so having myself worked on some remote islands in the Bahamas and finding all sorts of plastic, what was the perception of the Marshall Island people about where the plastic was going, was coming from, and was there any animosity or?
That's a great question. One thing I found that was so unique in the Marshalls was they were really Western culture did not come to their lifestyle until World War II. So they really are on the unique turning point of going from a traditional, very intact cultural society to the influence of the West. So I was always struck with even their perception about litter. I was there in 2000, and they still would throw their soda cans and throw their own bottles. And I would say to the students I taught, "Why are you doing that?" And they said, "Oh, that's how we get rid of things." But if you go back a generation or two before them, everything was biodegradable. Their plates were made out of pandana leaves. Nothing that they had was litter in the way that we understand it. So it was such a unique learning experience for me that, this is a culture that not too long ago had no garbage in the way that we understand it. They lived on fish and breadfruit, all of the local things that sustain their culture. So we would, and when I was there, we started doing ocean cleanups, which I've heard are still happening, but that wasn't even part of their culture because the ocean was, everything there belonged there. So litter has become a huge issue when you think about a way of life that doesn't even know what to do with plastic and soda cans. So of course the island is now littered in all sorts of ways, and a lot of the ocean pollution washes up there. Like many of us that have lived in their cultures, they are not angry people. They don't seem to hold a grudge. They seem to care for their earth, care for their section of earth in terms of wanting to honor it. So I know now there's a lot more movement towards cleaning up the ocean, picking up litter, trying to educate the young people not to throw it away. So yeah, in some ways, I think that's why I shared the history of the nuclear testing there. I mean, they are people that have had so many injustices, and when we think about our way of life that sometimes perpetuates the harm to others. So no, they were never angry that our water bottles from Hawaii were floating there, but I think it's something for us in our context to be aware of. So that's a great question.
You talked a lot about the Catholic theology having a dialogue with science. Could you speak a little bit about how other Christian traditions are doing that or not doing that?
Sure. I think right now I'm teaching an interfaith leadership class at Dominican, and it's a unique space to kind of learn more about other traditions. I would say, and I'm sure some people here could speak to it, but certainly the Hindu tradition, I think, has such a sacred place for water, for parts of the earth. So I think there are other traditions that are making similar moves to kind of bring science in and to understand the biology of things. I also would say that the water crisis, climate change is a unifying place for multiple traditions, even within the Christian faith, but also different, my friends that are Jewish scholars, Muslim scholars, especially with my work on water, we all care about water. We all have it as a sacred part of our tradition. And we're all trying to understand the science better so that we can find, ethical responses. So I think your question is a great point of thinking about different traditions and how they approach this dialogue between science and religion, but also how every different tradition, I can't think of a tradition that does not honor water in some way. So I think that's a great point and something that certainly there's a lot of potential to continue in that way. But I think water I always find is a unifying source. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Is there one more?
Thank you. I was very impressed with the statement, do small things and people will notice. I feel very frustrated, so many things. And I realize what I'm going to say is not a small thing because it may be some master controls. But if they can't do it for this ecological conference, for the next ecological conference, perhaps we don't have to have the air conditioning quite so cranked up.
Great. No, thank you. And again, I think it's that idea of small things. I thought about that. One of the things when I waded into ecological issues was flying a plane is one of the most unjust things we can do for the planet. So again, to hear last night that this is carbon neutral, that Duquesne was doing enough to offset those of us that flew here. But I think you're right. It's trying to think about what small things can we do and where might we push ourselves in our own communities to maybe experience some uncomfortability to make an impact. Robert said this morning, turning off the light bulbs. I mean, my dad's been telling me to do that for my whole life. So, I think there are little things we can do. I see with raising young children that if we start to, have water healthy practices at a young age, that hopefully it's a part of their paradigm. They don't know anything else. So thank you. All of our small things collectively are big things. So great. Well, thank you all. It really was, Great.
But that's another organization.
Great. Do you want to say it again?
The Global Catholic Climate Movement. And they're very much in, their whole emphasis is around Laudato Si. As a matter of fact, right now they have on their website, they have a pledge that they are asking people to sign during this time of season of creation.
Great. No, that's wonderful. And again, I think all of you will find when you sign up for those resources, you get constant emails and reminders. And again, sometimes it's just an email that might get dismissed, but it's something. And I think that's important to think about, those kind of movements. I invited Sally McFay to come to the center that I run at Dominican. She's a little bit older and said that she's not traveling, but she said instead of bringing her there, she would just gather a group to read Laudato Si together. So again, I think it's the impact of that document on all of us that are engaged in this is paramount. So thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. You began by having us come up with our own experience with water, and I was wondering if you could maybe circle back to that. And I'm thinking of those of us in a very urban environment where our only connection to water might be our shower or our water bottle. Can you think of any kind of practice for cultivating a sacred relationship to water?
Great. I think that reminds me of Robert's slide with he showed a slide of a Kohler water shower that has 10 shower heads that he said has the pressure that could remove paint. So again, I think it's for those of us that often live in cities and don't think about water a lot. Again, you all are in a unique setting here to have the three rivers. In Chicago, for years, I lived right on the edge of Lake Michigan, so I found that to be a unique place. But I think it's trying, again, especially for those of us in cities, to insert ourselves into nature. You know, and while we can't do that every day, Annie Dillard is one of my favorite authors. I mean, I think you become drawn to the people that are writing about the sacred in a way that are helping us imagine ourselves in relationship with Earth in a different way. But I would say, you know, in our house we talk a lot about water, so sometimes it's just those daily practices of, you know, with the kids it starts with, you know, did you remember your water bottle, and when did you drink your water? I mean, just trying to normalize the reality of water. Again, as I said, you know, turning off the tap when we brush our teeth. I mean, that was something we didn't do growing up. You know, we just turned the water on and let it run. So I would say trying to just find ways in your ordinary life to, even if just a moment to pause, to kind of give thanks for the water. And again, that's where I feel like the parish communities I work with are finding ways in their churches to do that. A few churches that I've worked with in Chicago that have renovated their baptismal font to have it be running water, so that again there's that sound of water, and that, you know, again starting with imagining our watery context, but then of course ending with, you know, what does that mean for us? So yeah, thanks for that question. So great, thank you all again. It's been great to be here.
Thank you very much, Rachel. What a wonderful presentation, and a very nice challenge to each of us to think of practical ways forward. The next session, we're having a break, but the next session is leading us forward into practicalities, and we are very blessed to have Richard Piacentini, who is the director of the Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens here in Pittsburgh, a national treasure, right on our doorstep, and he's going to be giving us some very practical hints about what he does there to inspire us about what we can do in our lives. So have a little break, stretch break, have some coffee, little cookies out there, and see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you.